Okay, here we go, and we're off. Hi there, welcome back to yet another episode of Days of Our Lives. No, um, this is another lecture for Humanities 1. I'm back, or rather, I'm still here. I haven't left, and may never leave again, depending on whether we can get our shit together regarding this pandemic. But anyway, um, okay, so last time we talked about the fall of the Roman Empire. This time we are going to be talking about what is commonly called the European Dark Ages and why. But first, I need to make some prefatory remarks. Prefatory. It's a fun word. Say it sometime. Work in conversation. Impress your friends. Prefatory. Roll your R's like that, just for an added zing. All right. The Dark Ages are part of what is commonly considered the medieval era, or in English, the Middle Ages. I grew up hearing about the Middle Ages. Of course, you hear about the Middle Ages back in the Middle Ages. Right, this is set during the Middle Ages. This is a world very like the European Middle Ages, etc., etc. Castles, dragons, knights, probably not dragons, but the rest of it. The thing is, I spent most of my life calling it the Middle Ages without ever stopping to think, what's it in the middle of? And there is something that it's in the middle of. Or at least, as it was understood by the early French historians of the period who sort of pioneered the field of medieval studies, as they understood it and interpreted what happened, it was in the middle of something. So before we plunge into the Dark Ages, which can be characterized as the early Middle Ages, I guess, let's talk about that. What is it in the middle of? Okay, so way back in the video on the Golden Age of Greece, I talked about humanism. I talked about this idea that humans are important and can know and control their world. This idea that shaped Greek art, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, their way of understanding the world, and the shift that they underwent from a purely mythological understanding of the world to a more rational understanding of the world. Okay. Humanism, as I said in the, I almost said episode. I guess they're kind of episodes, aren't they? I hope there's a budget increase for next season. We need better special effects. As I said in the episode on the Hellenistic world and Alexander the Great, I mentioned that the humanism of Golden Age Greece, the Golden Age of Athens specifically, was kind of out of step with the way that the rest of the world that was known at that time, was conducting itself. That the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent were still stuck largely in a mythological mode. Why did they fail to progress to humanism? Well, I mean, there were some humanistic elements that showed up in some of these civilizations. The Persians, who destroyed the Neo-Babylonians, set the Israelites free from their Babylonian captivity, and eventually came in conflict with those very self-same Greeks. They had some humanistic elements. Certainly, their empire granted much greater rights to women, for instance, and freedom of religion. Um, there were humanistic, uh, vibes, if you will, but they never progressed to. And on the other hand, while it was the case that educated Greeks were largely operating in a humanistic mode, many of them, maybe even most of them, still carried out the Greek religion, right? Made sacrifices to the gods, and so on and so forth, because it's just what you do. I don't want you to get this idea that the Greeks were purely humanistic and the other civilizations in the region were purely ahumanistic or operating in a mythological mode. Still, the humanism of the Greeks was far more pronounced than the humanistic elements elsewhere. And for my money, the reason for that is autocracy. The reason for that is the fact that the autocracy, still characteristic of the Persians, the other Fertile Crescent civilizations, Egypt, and places like that, these civilizations, in a sense, relied upon their mythological mode of thinking, their mythological mode of understanding the world to justify the powers of the autocrat. The autocrat ruled by dint of their association with the gods and monsters who actually ran the world. If you don't believe that gods and monsters actually run the world, then what good is the autocrat? He's just a guy in a dumb outfit in a very fancy room, and you don't need that. So, as we discussed, the Greeks and then the Romans pursued systems of government that reflected the material conditions of the areas in which their societies originated. Lacking the massive productive capability of large-scale intensive agriculture, they developed simple kingships rather than the pyramidal-shaped autocratic societies. And out of those simple kingships, it was a small step to simply eliminate the king and replace the king with a body of law that would arbitrate among the various upper class factions. Okay, now, this is a humanistic advance in the development of these societies. They shifted from, well, they never had a leader who was wholly dependent on this mythological mode for legitimacy. Instead, the leader was dependent upon the cooperation of the prominent families, the nobility, if you will. And once that leader was eliminated and the rule of law was instituted, you have, well, quite frankly, humans made those laws. Right? That's a humanistic impulse. Humans were governing themselves, in effect. And you might say, but Professor Schertz, humans were still in charge of the Persian Empire. Yes, technically, from our point of view, the Persian emperor was absolutely a human. But not from the point of view of the Persians. From the point of view of the Persians and the Israelites and the Egyptians and all the other people who had these sort of autocratic societies, the person in charge was in direct communion with or even a member of the group of gods and monsters who ran the world. So, I tend to think that the reason why humanism flourished in Greece and then later in Rome, or roughly contemporaneously in Rome, and never reached its full flourish in this period anyway, in the rest of the Fertile Crescent and the North Atlantic, or the North Mediterranean, the North of Africa. I'll get that right. The reason why it never really managed to reach full flourish in these other places is because they could not afford to get rid of the mythological mode of thinking, especially the rulers. The rulers had a vested interest in making sure the mythological mode of thinking remained firmly entrenched in their societies because it justified and legitimated the power of the autocrats in those societies. Okay, so humanism. The humanism of Greece might have remained a weird local phenomenon if, say it with me now, Alexander hadn't have conquered the world in the name of Greek philosophy. And he smeared the Greek humanism everywhere. Now that doesn't mean that the successor states that sprang up after Alexander immediately became fully humanist. But it meant that the humanist philosophy of the Greeks was available. It permeated these cultures where Alexander had once ruled. Likewise, the Romans, as they took over Italy, the very next place they went, or the people they had the most contact with, were the Greeks, right? And they took over the heartland of Greece. And the Romans, not being much inclined to deep thought themselves, discovered that the Greeks had a rich and detailed philosophical tradition, and they said, yeah, let's just take that. Yeah, that's ours now, right? If you were a Roman child, you were educated, probably by a Greek slave, in the Greek language and the Greek tradition of literature and philosophical thought. Now, when you got older and became a full-grown person, you were expected to kind of go, oh, I'm very educated. And they're like, so you do philosophy? And you're like, no, I'm Roman. I stab things or build shit. Very Roman attitudes, very practical people. Philosophy is great for the Greeks, and it's nice for showing off around town, just, show that you've got an education, but when you get right down to it, you stab things or build shit. That's how a Roman does it. Okay. Nonetheless, the Romans lived by rule of law. Yes, they continued to venerate the Roman gods and their own older Roman traditions. Roman religion was very weird. The Romans never saw a religion they didn't want to gank and take again. By the time we get to the full-blown, the height of the Republic, the Roman religious traditions are a mixture of Etruscan religion and ancient Roman religion and Greek religion rebranded with the serial number filed off and Roman names painted over most of it. So, anyway, although they continued to venerate the Roman gods, and they were not fully humanistic either, the humanism of the Greeks was alive and well in the Roman tradition. Now, what happens to that humanism of the Greeks when Rome begins to... Remember, I said it didn't fall, it slowly slides off the couch onto the floor. What happens? Well, of course, since the Roman emperor was effectively an autocrat, the importance of the humanistic tradition of Rome grows less and less. And then, remember what I said towards the end of that video on the Roman Empire? As imperial power crumbled in the West, people increasingly turned to local strongmen, local structures of authority to get them through. And north of the Alps, in what we would call Europe proper, in France, Germany, places like that, although those didn't exist yet, that's what we call them now. In places like that, the structures of power were largely associated with the Germanic tribes that existed there. And these Germanic tribes had never really absorbed the tradition of humanism. So what we have is the tradition of Greek humanism as born in the Golden Age of Greece in the 5th century BCE, spread all over the whole region by Alexander in the 4th century BCE, and then carried through by the Romans throughout the entire Republican period and the early imperial period even, up until maybe 2nd, 3rd, maybe even 4th century CE. The last few hundred years of Rome, this humanistic tradition was fading away to be replaced by a different kind of mythological orientation to the world, a different kind of sense that gods and monsters run everything, and that humans are relatively insignificant, and the only way for humans to survive is to suck up to the gods and monsters. Now, the Germanic tribespeople had always felt that way, and they had their own gods, but for a long time, they had been Christians, mostly Aryan Christians. A-R-I-A-N, not A-R-Y-A-N. Aryan Christians, which meant they call it Aryanism. I'm not going to get into the boring, I don't think it's boring, I think it's fascinating, but you will almost certainly think it's boring. I'm not going to get into the boring task of chopping up all the theology in the various ways that it was understood in that period. But let's just say it's not quite bog standard Christianity as we understand it today. Has something to do with the divinity of Jesus and Mary and so on and so forth. Anyway, but they were Christians. And whatever you think of Christianity, their understanding of Christianity was that humans were relatively insignificant, that a god, rather than gods, ran the world, that there were absolutely monsters in the world, they called them demons, and that the only way to protect yourself from the monsters and to get anywhere in the world and to, maybe have any kind of prosperity was to be faithful in the rituals and devotions to the Christian God who would protect you from the demons, and that was that. There wasn't a trace of humanism in this. So, with the crumbling of the might of the Roman Empire, and frankly with the crumbling of the Roman Republic's institutions as imperial autocracy displaced them, the tradition of humanism crumbled as well. It just sort of washed away by the waves of time, if you will. Until when we reach the final period where Rome can really have been said to have fallen, which some people date it to Odoacer in 476 or Alaric in 510. Either way, certainly by the early 6th century CE, it was a done deal. The point is, by that time, for sure, the tradition of humanism was gone. And some of you are saying, how does this relate to being in the middle of things? I'll tell you! Roughly, the one reason I kind of like the 476 date, even though it is, in my opinion, a little early, the only reason I kind of like it is because almost exactly 1,000 years later, about 1450 or thereabouts, you get the Italian Renaissance really hitting strong. Now, Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. So why is it a French word being used in Italy? Again, the scholars of the Middle Ages, the early ones and the most influential ones were French. So what happens, spoiler alert, for something that happened, 800 years ago. Spoiler alert, what happens in about 1450, in that general frame, is that starting in Italy and spreading rapidly outward throughout Europe, there is a rediscovery, if you will, maybe a re-embracing of the humanism of the classical Greeks and early Romans. The art, the literature, the philosophy. It is embraced as a way of understanding and living in the world that is an alternative to medieval Christianity. And this becomes a wildly popular trend, reshaping societies all over Europe at that time. So it is a rebirth of what? That's right, classical humanism. And that's what the Middle Ages is in the middle of. Starting in the 5th century BCE, we have the birth of Greek humanism, of classical humanism. It spreads in the 4th century CE. It is picked up by the Romans in maybe the 3rd century BCE. And it lasts at least until the beginning of the imperial period, and probably a few centuries into that. So at minimum, it's going strong, maybe into the 1st or 2nd century CE in the Roman Empire. But as the empire slides deeper into autocracy and its power crumbles and is displaced by the cultural and political imperatives of the Germanic tribespeople, then ultimately that classical humanism fades out of the cultural memory to be replaced by another mythological mode of operation, or rather in this case, a theistic mode of operation. A theistic way of understanding the world that is not humanistic. About 1,000 years go by, and then Europe plunges headfirst back into classical humanism. So the Middle Ages, in a sense, is the interruption of the rise and spread of humanism. If you can imagine it starting, this analogy may be a little too on point for our current COVID era, but you can imagine it starting in Greece and spreading like a disease through the Fertile Crescent and Egypt and the north of Africa, and Italy gets infected by humanism, and it spreads everywhere that the Romans go, which is everywhere, and then it kind of goes away. But about 1,000 years later, boom! Another wave of it flares up, and it's spreading everywhere like wildfire, almost as if that intervening 1,000 years never happened. The progress of humanism is one lens through which to understand Western history. The history of Europe and the civilizations, the societies that were sprung from European civilization. It is one lens through which you can understand Western history. And certainly the early medieval scholars who were French, which is why Renaissance is a French word, not an Italian word, even though it's the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance is the rebirth of classical humanism. And the medieval period, the Middle Ages, are in the middle of two periods of growth and spread of classical humanism. Okay. So, that's where we are. Now, the latter period of the imperial era and shading off into the first few centuries of what we might otherwise call the early medieval period, or sometimes called late antiquity, where the classical modes of life, as understood in the Roman Empire, have not fully gone away or fully been displaced by the new political and social order that would come to be dominant in the Middle Ages. But regardless, we can peg the beginning of the Middle Ages for our purposes around 500, let's say. Just, for the hell of it. Maybe even 450 if we're rounding off. But certainly by 500, certainly by 550, it's a done deal. And that puts us in the Dark Ages, which is a name often applied to the early part of the Middle Ages. Now, what would that mean? Well, fortunately, we've talked about a Dark Age before, haven't we? We talked about the Greek Dark Age. Now, how did the Greek Dark Age come about? With the end of the Bronze Age and the Bronze Age collapse, and specifically the collapse of Mycenaean society. Urban population shrunk or even vanished entirely in some places. Arts, the sophisticated arts associated with urban life, were lost. Literacy plummeted because of the instability and chaos and danger and violence in the land. Long-range trade dropped away. Communities became more or less self-sufficient. They had to, or they die. The majority of the population, the vast majority of the population was employed in farming, so on and so forth. Well, hell, every single one of those things happened in the European Dark Ages, which probably pick up from, like I said, you can peg it anywhere from 450 to 500 to 550, but somewhere around there. The European Dark Ages have exactly the same characteristics. Because, like the Mycenaeans, and even to a greater degree than the Mycenaeans, the Romans in Europe had developed a significant urban life that was dependent upon the ability of the Roman government to enforce peace on the surrounding lands, the lands surrounding the cities and towns, their ability to move resources in the form of money or food from the surrounding areas into the urban centers. And both of these things were underpinned by the culture of literacy. Rome was, weirdly enough, run by civilians for the most part. Your average Roman noble certainly would take place in, or take part in a war if it came. They would go along and ride on campaigns and command troops and whatnot. But they were not soldiers by trade. They were politicians. Their whole thing was running the government. Professional bureaucrats and politicians. That was what they were. And the funny thing is, when the Roman government stopped being able to enforce peace around these areas, it's weird. If somebody comes to kill you, you're not going to be able to pass a resolution at them. You got to be able to fight, right? Who's going to be able to enforce peace and protect farmers from the depredations of those who want to take their food in a time of food scarcity and unpredictability? There's going to be a lot of people who want to take their food. Well, remember what I said. The German tribespeople that had moved into Roman territory and adopted Latin customs and the Latin language and so on and so forth, still maintained their communities in a lot of ways. And that included the idea that all adult males were fighting males, and that there would be one among them who was kind of a war chief, or in a sense a simple king, if you will, in a simple kingship model. And they started turning to that. They started turning to the German tribespeople who had lived in Roman territory as their new model for social organization in an effort to protect themselves. So, in the European Dark Age, which, like I said, lasts from, you can peg it at 450, 500, 550, whatever, but it lasts until at least the 8th century CE, so the 700s. So for a couple hundred years, 200 to 300, somewhere thereabouts, which you will note is almost exactly the same period that the Greek Dark Ages last. So that's interesting as a data point. It's almost like there is some sort of upper limit to how long it will take a society to kind of dig itself out, at least partially, from this kind of chaos. I don't know, but anyway. In the European Dark Ages, things were pretty bleak. Urban populations did vanish. Literacy did vanish. The more sophisticated arts did vanish. I told you before, I'm going to link to a video about Concrete, which got an insufferable British narrator who you will love to hate. We'll hate him together as a group. He'll be graded on it. No, I'm kidding. The Romans had discovered a way of manufacturing concrete that was revolutionary for its time and allowed them to build amazing things. And their engineering ability, Romans scattered people and built shit, and their engineering ability, their ability to build shit was remarkably advanced. And in the European Dark Ages, that goes away, right? That goes away. A lot of peasants in Europe lived in the shadow of things that Romans had built out of concrete. And not only did they not know how to make the concrete, even if they had known how to make the concrete, they would not have had the technical skill to build those things. In some cases, they had no idea what those things even were for. Right? The great aqueducts, which are mentioned in your book, and will be mentioned in that video that we're going to hate the narrator of. The great aqueducts that the Romans built to bring water from high mountain lakes into urban areas. First of all, they weren't needed because the urban areas were devoid of life at this point. The aqueducts had started to crumble, and there were European peasants who had no idea what the aqueducts even were. They assumed, because they were 30, 40, 50 feet high, they assumed they had been built by a race of giants. They didn't know. They had no idea where the damn thing came from, what it was for, what that material was it was made of. It looked kind of like rock, but it wasn't rock. Might as well have been science fiction, as far as they were concerned. Imagine what that would be like, right? Imagine some kind of post-apocalypse, right, in America, like some kind of Mad Max kind of thing, where you look at skyscrapers, and you're not even sure who built them, or you're not even sure how they built them, or why they built them. Right? All you know is that you and the people left, riding around in your crazy cars and your leather pants, you guys can't build shit like that. Right? That's the kind of position that the peasants were in the Dark Ages. So, okay. The European Dark Ages, lasting from roughly 500 to sometime in the 700s, were a period of complete chaos. Guys with swords ruled over everything, pretty much by justification of having a sword. Right? The warriors, took what they wanted, and if some other warriors were in their way, they fought for it. It was a warrior society. It was what has been called by some historians a completely militarized society, which means every aspect of their existence, from top to bottom, was oriented around the support of the fighting class, the group of people in society that did the fighting. And those people ran everything. Because again, post-apocalyptic wasteland, right? The people fight, who are there in charge, right? You're not having Senate meetings. You're having groups of people with swords stabbing other people with swords, and if they win, then that's the thing that happens, and they're in charge. Okay. So, in the early Dark Ages, in the European Dark Ages, what happened was society kind of reshaped itself around the Germanic model of society, which was a warrior society. Adult males who were capable of bearing arms and who had the money, because proper arms and armor cost money. So all adult males were expected to fight at need, and the ones who had the money to really kit themselves out well were kind of the elite warriors. And among them, there would be a strong man who could, through dint of combat ability and maybe personal charisma and maybe tradition, based on what family he belonged to, someone who could lead them. So a simple king who could organize cooperation among the nobles, which is to say the elite fighters. This was another way to get simple kingship. But the authority of the kings in Germany was also always a religious matter as well, ordained by their gods. Now, since they had converted to Christianity, the simple king was also invested with a certain amount of religious authority, and the justification for his authority was religious in nature. But this time it was Christian rather than the Germanic gods that underwrote the legitimacy of the simple kings. The tension in Dark Ages society, however, was that Christianity is not fundamentally that kind of religion, let's just say. Christianity was originally a counterculture religion, opposed to authority, and in favor of the creation of a radical society based on love and forgiveness and devotion to God, and outside of the authority of the Roman emperors, who were regarded as brutal, and the kings of Israel, who were regarded as corrupt. It was a counterculture religion. So there's already a fundamental tension. Second, during the Roman imperial period, Christianity had accumulated a great body of theological literature that was all based upon Platonic philosophy, the philosophy of the Greek, the classical Greek thinker Plato. They all sprang from that kind of area. So a truly educated Christian priest would still have a lot of that classical humanism sort of stuck up in their brain. And of course, that kind of humanism is directly at odds with the form and the nature of society in the Dark Ages, which is a brutal, ahumanistic society. How does this tension play out? Well, throughout the Dark Ages, there was a struggle between the temporal lords, if you will, the fighting men who ran everything by dint of being able to kill people who said they couldn't, and the Christian church, which was everywhere, because Rome had become Christian and then spread the Christian church everywhere that Rome went, which was everywhere. So they couldn't escape the Christian church. They needed the Christian church because the people were Christian to legitimize their rule. But they needed to be rid of the Christian church, or control it at least, because its fundamental doctrines and philosophical heritage were strictly at odds with their way of running society. So, throughout the early Dark Ages, the doctrine, the way things were done, was that usually the local thug with a sword got to dictate who would be a priest, who would be a bishop, which is like the general manager for the priests, like regional manager, like for a Cracker Barrel or a McDonald's, you know what I mean. The regional manager, the bishop, in other words, he would appoint those offices. And usually these were not trained priests. These were not trained members of the Christian church. They were usually family members or associates upon whom they could rely to say, yes, God wants him to be in charge. And it's like, you're not even a priest. It's like, I'm a priest if I say so, stab. Right? It was kind of like that. But the church in Rome, where the Bishop of Rome, otherwise known as the Pope, was still close to the centers of the old traditions of literature and philosophy. And in Italy, northern Italy in particular, they never really suffered through the Dark Age the way that the rest of Europe did. Literacy, urban life, the tradition of classical humanism never fully died out, which is kind of why the Italian Renaissance started there, but we'll get to that later, towards the end of the class. So anyway, the Dark Ages were chaotic. They were ruled by violence, and the people in charge are the people who were most skilled at committing violence and motivating others to commit violence. The Christian church, paradoxically, thrived during this period, but only under the dominance of those violent men who ran society. Okay, so when did the Dark Ages end? What happens? How does the story end? It's hard to put an exact date, as with all things, on it. One date that you could try to fix to it is the year 800. And I don't mean 800 and something. For once, I mean exactly the year 800. Pretty crazy, right? It's even got an easy to remember date. Christmas, December 25th, the year 800 CE, or AD, as we used to call it. 800 CE, Christmas Day. A Frankish king, and Frankish in this case just means someone of the Germanic heritage. France and Germany, they were all mixed up and considered Franks at this point. Some of the Frankish heritage, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, as he is called when they Frenchify his name. Charlemagne was descended from a line of other French kings who had managed to create a bit of a dynasty, that is to say, a succession of family rule. Now, we think of, kingship as passing from father to son in unbroken line for hundreds of years. We think of that, but that's an artifact of later on in the Middle Ages and even the post-medieval period. In the actual medieval period, the thing is, especially in the Dark Ages, a king had to be able to fight. And people were constantly challenging them for their authority. Other people wanted to be king. So it was very rare that a king could manage to create a succession of father to son to grandson and so on and so forth that lasted more than maybe one or two generations before some other family beat them, knocked them out of the top spot and took over. This is very rare. And also there were zillions of kings in Europe. It's not like there were any defined nations at this point. Everybody, spoke, everybody in this area of Germany spoke pretty much the same language, you might say, but there'd still be dozens and dozens and dozens of kings, because being king just means, in this context, you don't have to answer to anybody in terms of your little group here. So, depending on how small or little your group was, you could be living within close proximity to half a dozen other kings. So, whatever. Anyway, Charles the Great, I like to call him Big Charlie, Charlemagne, Big Charlie, managed to capitalize and consolidate the successes of his forebears and leveraging both reputation, actual military skill, and some political ability that he had, he united, pretty much all of France and Germany, which is enormous amounts of territory for that era. And in an effort to, he could have just been another Dark Ages king who happened to be more successful than the others. But one reason why we might put his era as at least the beginning of the end for the Dark Ages is that rather than just ruling over it brutally as an autocratic king, instead he went and he negotiated with the Christian churches. He realized that he couldn't just keep them under his thumb forever. He managed to strike a deal wherein on Christmas Day, December 25th, the year 800, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. So a few things to note. He was not Roman. He spoke no Latin, probably couldn't even read. He was holy in the sense that the bishop said he was, and that's kind of how that works. Why would he call himself a Roman emperor? That makes no sense. Well, it kind of does. When you think that his explicit goal was to revive the humanism and the tradition of civilization of Rome, right? He may or may not have been able to read, but he certainly had people who could read, who had books that they could read to him. And he understood that they were living in the ruins of a once great civilization. And he understood that rather than their world of violence just being business as usual, that it was, in fact, a post-apocalyptic wasteland in a certain sense. He had himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor as kind of a PR move. And he began to institute laws, not just the whims of the king who is all-powerful. No, laws, the actual rule of law. He tried to institute it. He set educational standards. He set standard taxes. He had important roads repaired and expanded for the first time since the actual Roman Empire. He was building infrastructure. He was trying to make Europe into what it once was. He was trying to drag it kicking and screaming out of the apocalypse. So, did he succeed? Did he fail? Well, here's a hint. Some people call this the Carolingian Renaissance. Carolingian is the adjectival form of Charlemagne. Why? Because the French are insane. That's why. But this was the Carolingian Renaissance. And if I'm telling you that the Middle Ages ended with the Italian Renaissance some 600 years later, there is your hint that the Carolingian Renaissance didn't stick. Anyway, it did not, for a couple of reasons. First of all, remember what I said about it was very rare that a king would be able to sustain a dynastic rule more than a couple of generations? Same thing happened here. Charlemagne's sons were not Charlemagne by any stretch of the imagination, and they mostly began fighting amongst each other, which did nothing for his idea of unifying the realm and bringing peace to Europe. More importantly, it was right around this time, in the 9th century CE, when we suddenly get, holy shit, Vikings, right? Now, the Norwegian people, or not Norwegian only, but people from Scandinavia in general, Sweden, Norway, things like that, places where we would call those today, they had existed. It's not like they suddenly appeared. They didn't beam down from a spaceship. But for reasons that scholars are still debating, in this period, they began making raiding expeditions into England, Ireland, and Northern Europe. And they had very advanced sailing technology for the period. They were expert sailors. They were fierce fighters, the people they sent on these expeditions anyway. And they could kind of show up anywhere at any time and storm ashore and start taking your shit, killing you, burning your villages, so on and so forth. So between the fact that Charlemagne's kids were fighting each other rather than trying to keep his realm intact, and the sudden and disconcerting appearance of Vikings, the Carolingian Renaissance did not quite stick. And in large part, Europe, after a brief, glorious period where it looked like they were going to pull themselves out of this, started to slide back towards the chaos of the Dark Ages. The real turning point comes in the 11th century, so in the 1000s. So, 200 years after Charlemagne. The real turning point comes then. And certainly, if the Dark Ages ended at any point, maybe you can peg the year 800, but you can definitely peg it to the 1000s, the 11th century, for a variety of reasons. A combination, a kind of a confluence of events. First of all, the Christian Church, the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, the papacy was occupied during that century by a series of politically skilled, highly energetic reformers who wanted to get the Christian Church out from under the dominance of the guys with swords. They were insisting that the Church in Rome had sole authority to appoint bishops and priests, and that they were trying to exert more influence over the rulers, trying to discourage them from wanton bloodshed, right? Rather than merely rubber stamping anything they did, they were saying, no, you can't just kill your neighbors, right? In a sense, they were kind of trying to attempt what Charlemagne attempted. They were trying to pacify Europe, not through political unification with a sword, in your hand, like Charlemagne did, but through the instrument of the Christian church and the spiritual teachings of it. They knew that the people believed, the common folk believed. And even if the nobility were like, yeah, God and all, but I really want to kill that guy and take his stuff. Even if that was the mindset of the nobility, they could motivate the people to disrupt the power of the nobles through their belief in the church, but only if they could control who was in the pulpit, which priests were installed where, which bishops were installed where, right? They thought these reformers in Rome believed they could bring about a massive cultural change if they could just unify the church and fully exert its powers throughout Europe. That was one reason. Another reason is that times got a little bit easier. The 11th century had unusually good weather. Agricultural crops grew well. There was an explosion of food, an explosion of population, and there was less motivation for the nobles to attack their fellow nobles in search of food and resources. There was enough for everyone to go around. So with these twin impulses, these twin effects happening at the same time, they were on the road to a more peaceful, more cohesive Europe. A Europe where the humanistic elements that are sort of buried within the classical philosophy-derived theology of the church could drive towards more regard for the individual, more regulation of what nobles could and couldn't do. Rather than just being able to do anything because they had a sword, the idea was, if the church got its way, that they would be responsible to something else. Not the rule of law per se, but at least to the rule of the church, which had laws that were specified. It had spiritual laws that were written down, a theology that had been carefully worked out over hundreds of years. So it wasn't quite the same as classical humanism, but it was certainly a step up from abject anarchy. Now, all of this culminates in 1093 or 1095, I can never remember which. One of the two, 1093 or 1095. So right at the end of the 11th century, this culminates in Pope Urban and his call for crusade. His call for the nobility of Europe to unite under the banner of the church and march into the Western Fertile Crescent, into what they called the Holy Land, and retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. Did Urban do this because he literally believed that this was a spiritual priority? I don't know. The guy didn't leave a diary. Maybe? Who knows? But Urban was a skilled political operator, and one thing is for sure. If your main concern is that your warrior class is spending all of its time, not surprisingly, making war on each other, but you can't get rid of them because you don't have the juice for that, and they'll stab you if you try, because they are the warrior class, maybe you can convince them that it's not okay to kill other Christians, but it's totally fine to kill people who aren't Christians, and you can kind of export the violence. Was that his reason? I don't know. He cannot have been ignorant of it. He was a smart man. He must have seen that that would be one of the effects. The other effect that he must have been aware of was that this would, for the first time, I mean, again, we're used to thinking of the medieval church is sort of all powerful. But throughout the Dark Ages, it hadn't been. The church had been fighting tooth and nail, in fact, to gain some autonomy and power of its own, rather than just having the local guys with swords appointing whoever, the priest and the bishop and whatnot. Urban understood that if he could motivate purely on the basis of theology, if he could motivate nobles from England and France and Germany and all over Europe to do what he asked them to do, to travel east thousands of miles and fight an enemy they never met in an unknown place, that if he could do that, then what he will have done, effectively, is created kind of a world government. All the Christian churches from all over Europe would be linked to him and issuing directives at the authority of the Pope, which the local nobility would be spiritually and after that politically obligated to obey. In other words, Urban was angling for not just a universal church that embraced all of Europe, all of the believers in the land. He was angling for a political superpower, something that could provide the structure of authority necessary to drag Europe out of the Dark Ages. And it was centered in Rome even, right? A new Roman Empire, but a spiritual one rather than a secular one. How did this work out? Next time on Humanities. I'll also link to some videos on the Crusades. I think they're hilarious. You're required to watch them anyway. You're not required to think they're hilarious, but there's bonus points in it for you if you go. No, that's a lie. There's no bonus points if you think they're hilarious, but you should, because they are. And if you don't, you're wrong. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, so that's what we'll talk about next time. What happens after the 11th century? The Dark Ages might have started to end in the 8th or in the 9th century, in the 800s, but they absolutely, definitely, for certain, for reals, pinky promise, ended by the 11th century, certainly by the end of the 11th century, with the call to crusade. In fact, you might regard the first crusade in 1093 or 1095, I don't remember which, you might regard the first crusade as the end, the definitive end point of the Dark Ages in Europe, after which we move into the second half of the Middle Ages, which are called commonly the High Middle Ages, because everyone was high all the time. No, I'm kidding. Also not true. But the High Middle Ages is what they're called. Sort of the apex of medieval culture. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, cats, any questions? No? Okay. The cats don't have any questions, which means I'm assuming you don't have any questions either. All right. So we're going to stop and backstab. Please have a good day. Please stay safe. It's very cold out there. Bundle up. We're almost through this. Let's try to get through the rest of it, yo. Okay, bye.